My name is Ed Colger, and I have the pleasure and honor of introducing our speaker. And we have some people coming in. Let them settle down. Before I finish our remarks, they'll be brief and I'll be gone. There's a right after the talk on the other side of this room. Okay, so don't forget the goodies there. Now, our speaker today addresses a very niggling question. How do you imagine the global studies in education and under conditions of globalization? To give some context to this question, I thought a brief poem might capture the niggling question that our speaker will be addressing. Now, the title is "It's Easy to Lose Faith."
Thanks.
A horse and cart went past. I'll repeat it again, so make sure you grasp what's going on. Imagine yourself the speaker of the poem. A horse and a cart went past. I see, I believe in them. They grow dark. The horse and the cart went past, but the horse had a horse. The cart had a cart. They led their own selves, large from shadow, along the acacia. And now it's hard for me to believe in the horse and cart. It's awful tough with so many clamoring and flashing voices of 8 billion people now in a global society for the first time to know who to believe, right? Who has the right answer? What are the right values? And how do I know they're right? Well, fortunately today, we have a speaker who we can trust, at least to address that question. Professor Basil Rizvi is an emeritus professor of global studies in education at the University of Melbourne. And as some of you already know, he is emeritus from the University of Illinois here at Urbana-Champaign. He has written extensively on the issues of identity and culture in transnational contexts, globalization, and education policy. A sequel of his widely acclaimed book, Globalizing Educational Policy, was recently republished under the title Reimagining Globalization and Education. He's still emeritus, but not retired, because he is an editor-in-chief of the 4th edition of the International Encyclopedia of Education. Basil is currently researching educational reform in Bhutan, dealing now with the present leader of Bhutan. He is a fellow of the Australian Academy of the Social Sciences, past editor of the journal Discourse Studies in Cultural Politics of Education, and a past president of the Australian Association of Research in Education. Basil, it's a great pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Ed. I'm actually delighted to have this opportunity to reminisce and describe the last 25 years of my scholarship in and around the issues of globalization. Many of them were pushed by my appointment here. Let me say something about my appointment here. I came here from Australia, where I was at Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology. I had an administrative job as an associate provost international, and I came here largely as a result of the encouragement and indeed support of my very good friend Earl Kellogg, who was an associate provost international here at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. He had managed to persuade the university that the university needed to internationalize by bringing in people from elsewhere to work on issues of globalization and internationalization. So departments were able to make applications to, I think it was called International Excellence Hire Program. I don't know the details, but it had some grand title like that. Anyway, my colleague Nick Berboulis, who I've known for quite some time, made the application that he would like me to come here. And luckily, I was appointed. And I came here exactly 10 days before 9/11. Okay, so as a result, it was a very interesting time to be in the United States because 10 days were with a great deal of enthusiasm and a great deal of excitement, followed by a lot of worry and a lot of concern. I was brought here on the same day under the same scheme as my very good friend Jan Netherveen Peters in sociology department. So we arrived in exactly the same day, and of course have since become very, very good friends. And he has influenced me greatly on my own thinking in a whole range of ways. He has a very strange brain, which goes in all different directions, but in directions that give you reason to pause and think about issues in very serious ways. You don't always agree, and sometimes he fights and fights vigorously, but nonetheless, he's an absolutely wonderful interlocutor who's really, really good to have a chat with. Indeed, each time I come to the United States, I stop over at the University of California, Santa Barbara, where he is now, and spend 2 days jostling with him about a whole range of ideas, and it really is quite interesting to do that. I was brought here, and just as I arrived, a very distinguished scholar called Professor Mohsin, who was an Afghani economist and development studies person in education, had just retired. So that there was a vacancy in the Department of EPS, Educational Policy Studies, as it was called then, now EPOL, that was looking for somebody to teach his courses, comparative and international education. I could not teach economics, which he taught, economics of education, but I had a go at comparative and international education. That was a new discipline to me. So I had to actually learn as quickly as I possibly can the traditions of that discipline and the ideas that framed his thinking. He was human capital theory guy who had worked with World Bank and indeed had done huge amount of development work in countries like Afghanistan, where he came from, as well as Maldives and Kenya and places like that. So he was a very different kind of person to me, who had come from an academic background in philosophy of education. And that's how I knew Nick. But I had to become a comparativist almost overnight. And that was an interesting challenge because it was a literature that I could both relate to, having lived in at least 4 countries before, but also find it deeply troubling as well. So, and I found the comparative education as a field of study deeply troubling. And I'll say something about why I found it so troubling. Comparative education in early part of, around the turn of the century was going through huge turmoil as a result of all the literature that was coming on the concept of globalization and analysis that were being presented on global networks and global forces and global connections and global imaginaries. At the same time, post-colonial theories had become quite popular and were widely used in a whole range of departments. And indeed, the notion of development itself, which was quite fundamental to understanding comparative and international education, was deeply, deeply criticized by a whole range of scholars. Some of you would know the work of Arturo Escobar, who wrote about post-development studies. So development studies, comparative studies, and international studies, all of those areas were in turmoil. Okay, around the turn of the century. All of them, okay, all of them, their fundamental premises were being questioned, largely on the ground that they were methodologically nationalist, methodological nationalism, that they viewed the world through the prism of the state. Okay, so if you described education, then you described education in Cameroon as being contained within that country rather than with forces outside the country. And internationalization effectively became an idea that tried to understand how what goes on within the local and national systems is related to forces coming in from outside and going out to outside. As a result, there is a relationship, and a complicated relationship between the local and the global that was being. At the same time, the idea of globalization, which had become popular through the course of 1990s, was actually described and analyzed and defined in a whole range of ways in just about every discipline, from literary studies to war studies to peace studies to sociology to anthropology. Everything was actually becoming an area of field of study that was affected by and was attempting to define a major way in which education might be defined. I found myself within those debates. So when I started reading about comparative education, I had been for 10 years reading about globalization since the fall of the Cold War, effectively in 1989. And I could not relate how comparative education and international education at that time could remain almost silent on these scholarship and advances that were taking place. And yet, there is no way that I could have taught it comparative and international education in the image or the register that Mohsin did it. Okay, not only because the notion of development was deeply problematic, but also because globalization literature had made comparative and international education a very different kind of beast than it had been before. So I'm fighting against a particular disciplinary tradition, but at the same time trying to work with that tradition and sort of say, how can we transform this tradition into something else? Instead of assuming that everything that was done in comparative and international education was irrelevant and useless and superseded by the forces of globalization, I was actually sort of saying there is something that comparativists did. The detailed historical work that they did of particular countries and particular policies was still important and was a resource that globalization people can ill afford to ignore. So basically, that was the major idea. So I needed to actually develop a program that actually reflected some of my own doubts and some of my own thinking. But I was indeed very lucky because at that time, around the faculty, largely as a result of Earl's contribution to the university, which is, in my view, was hugely significant and should be acknowledged. Okay, there were people that I could talk to around the university in various departments. David Wilson in geography, people in Anya Lumba in English, etc., etc. And we formed quite a close-knit group, and as a result started exploring new ideas and new ways of teaching about comparative education, but in ways that reflected contemporary developments, as well as contemporary theorizing in and around the notion of global. At the same time, the idea of global studies, which had existed way back to the 1960s, as Edward had reminded me so many times, was becoming popular again either. And that's where I captured the notion of global studies. So basically, the story of my my role in the development of global studies in education was a move from international comparative education to global studies. And of course, I found Ed and other people, fellow travelers, in that journey. And so as a result, there was an interesting time to do this. I managed to find and persuade some of my students that they might want to help me in thinking through these issues. So basically, what we did was bring a group of 6 people, including a faculty from CNI called Brenda Tefanenko, who was interested in these issues. She was a Canadian and was looking around for a new home. So between two of us, two faculties, and four students, including Nicole Lamus, who is sitting in the back, there, who's become quite a distinguished internationalist herself, international educator herself. Okay, we used to meet every Sunday night and talk about these issues at three levels. What are the ideas that we are engaging with that are helpful for us to think and rethink comparative and international education in the new register of global studies? That was one challenge. The other one is, what kind of courses, subjects might we develop? Okay, and the third one was to have a good time while we are talking about it. And I took the responsibility of cooking my very, very bad Indian food, but they didn't know about Indian food, so they tolerated my bad. And they always said this was great food, but I'm sure my mom would have said, what a load of rubbish. Nonetheless, they admired it and we had a good time. And the conversation became more and more serious in between a whole range of other things. Now, it became quite clear to us that if we wanted to develop a program in global studies in education, which is a decision we reached, and I tried with James Henderson, he said, go ahead and do it, okay? We wanted a program that didn't have discrete units, one here, one there, one on evaluation, one on research method, one on ethics, one on technology. We wanted to create a structure that was coherent, that was not only coherent, but also spoke to each other. So the core courses were so designed as to be developmental. So the thing that was done in the first course fed into the second course, and the second course fed into the third course, and so on and so on. That was very important to us because we said, if we are going to actually recast and reframe the field of comparative energy, and that's how ambitious and cocky we were. If we were going to do that, then we needed to actually develop not only one course, one subject, but a whole suite of courses that actually spoke to in a coherent fashion, in a sequential fashion. So in other words, we applied the best principles of curriculum development and curriculum design. One of the things that we objected to was there were a large number of programs that encourage individuals, faculty to teach this course or that course or that course, and there was no connection between those. We were absolutely insistent that there must be connection in the various courses that we develop. So that's actually what we decided to do. The next thing that we did was to get funding from UNESCO of all. I had been working for UNESCO, OECD, and to a lesser extent World Bank, but certainly OECD. I did a book in 2000 on globalization, OECD, and educational policy making. And as a result, I knew the organization pretty well. And also UNESCO. UNESCO very kindly, through their Bangkok office, regional office, gave us some money that allowed me to employ people to actually have a look at what is being said in policy documents in a number of different countries about globalization and its implications for education. Okay, so the project that we got funding for from UNESCO was to actually look at policy documents in a number of countries of the past 10 years and have a look at what use they are making and how are they defining globalization and the ways in which they think that the new world requires, as a result of global processes, a new set of policies and practices. So that was the project. We produced a report that is still on the websites if you want to have a look at it. It's called Shifting Understandings of Globalization in the Asia Pacific. But it led us to actually develop some kind of understanding as to how globalization was being thought about, not only in academic circles, but also in the policy circles, in departments, okay? And that was important to us. We wanted to bring those two things together so that we can... It became quite clear that so we did 11 countries their reports. And then we did some more countries outside the Asia Pacific, South Africa, England, United States, Australia, etc., as a way of developing a understanding of what is being said about globalization in these policy documents, in these policy reports. What became clear immediately is the structure of the argument, the discursive argument across all of those nations was very similar. Okay, they all expressed a huge amount of anxiety and about sense of crisis. They presented globalization as a challenge that needed to be met by educators and educationists. And they said globalization had opened up huge number of opportunities to finally transform education in a new image. Okay, so in other words, there was the negative and there were positive in the reports. Both of those things were presented, but all of them use the language of crisis, not all that different to the language of crisis, as was the case in that very important and famous document in 1980s called Nation at Risk in this country. Okay, it was very, very similar. And many of these people were talking about it. So what were they anxious about? Well, what did they think globalization was all about? Okay, well, to start off with, they said, economy ain't what it used to be. It is becoming increasingly globally integrated, globally networked, globally. And as a result of that, modes of production, modes of ownership, modes of consumption, and modes of circulation of money is changing and changing very rapidly. And that is raising some new issues that are opening up some possibilities. The third thing that they said was the nature of work and employment and labor relations are changing. And as a result, we are no longer preparing kids for certain kinds of jobs. Globalization and indeed technology has transformed them. So as a result, we cannot rely on the old curriculum and see it as satisfactory in relation to the pressures and the opportunities and challenges associated with globalization. Every report is saying this. Every report is saying that. Okay. They're also saying that mobility of people, ideas, and money is going to become ubiquitous and expand very rapidly. And as a result, what we've got to understand is that mobility is going to become a new motif, if you like, in and around global processes will proceed. In other words, mobility is something that is well worth studying. Okay, so those were some of the, and of course they pointed to the changing nature of economy, of technology, and how technology, especially information technologies, were really transforming. Now remember, this is in late 90s and early 2000s. Okay, so this is around 25 years ago. Okay, those are the things that people were saying. Okay, so what are the solutions that they provide? That's where there were some differences. Okay, different countries were proposing different kinds of solutions, but there were some solutions that were being embraced. And in embracing those solutions, they were drawing very heavily on the literature that was coming out of international organizations, the World Bank, OECD, IMF. In other words, they were looking at international organizations. The other source from where they were getting many of these recommendations for what needed to be done in education as a result of global processes becoming ubiquitous was corporations. Okay, so as a result, they were talking about Microsoft, all those kind of organizations. So things like 20th century skills, that idea came about, from corporations as much as it came out from national policy processes or global or international organizations. Now, so what are some of the things that they said that needed to be done? Okay. Before I say that, the other thing that they all highlighted, especially in developing countries, okay, or countries of the global south, is that number of students who will be going to universities is going to rise very rapidly. In other words, they pointed to the massification of higher education sector, and they assume that secondary education will be compulsory across all the time, across the entire 5-6 years of secondary schools. Okay, so basically massification. But they said that massification is going to have its problem. It's going to have a problem because it's going to put pressure on nation states to create new schools and new teachers, find new teachers and find new ways of teaching massified people, not the elite 5% at university, but the 50% who will go to the university. And as a result, the demography of universities and schools will change. And that will give rise to a new politics of difference, cultural difference. Okay, in other words, there'll be pressures from those people who were not part of higher education system or secondary education system in some countries will come in and they will make certain demands. And those demands will have to be treated. So much of the diversity and inclusion agenda from their perspective came from the recognition that massification is something that really requires a major rethink so that you can actually look at not only the students the number of students who are, but the kind of students who will be coming into the various sectors of education. So that became a major concern for them. So basically, something needed to be done to diversify the curriculum, to actually make the curriculum much more culturally responsive and gender responsive and all those sort of things that we now find 20 years later absolutely familiar. But they were done in the context of massification of education. Okay, because then there is problem of where do you put these people? The example that I could give that best illustrates the problem of massification is this. I worked in Vietnam, Mary and Bill know this, creating a new campus in Vietnam. And I went there on a regular basis to negotiate the contract to establish a new campus. And at that time, Vietnam was run by fairly strict communist government, not like now, but then they were really very pure, if you like. Why were they talking to us? Why would they be talking to a university abroad to establish a private campus? Although the university itself in Australia was public, its operations in Vietnam are private. Okay, why were they allowing a campus for 10,000 students? I couldn't figure it out. Okay, so I had a meeting with deputy minister of education, somewhere lower down the rung of ministers that they had. Okay, and I said, why? He was educated in Australia, so he spoke openly and had Australian sensibilities in many ways. And I said, why are you doing that? He said, Father, I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay, in Vietnam in 1998, there were 17 students matriculating from schools, and there was only one place for every 17 students. One place for every 17 students. One place. Okay. In other words, 16 students who graduate from high school with sufficient marks and ambition and aspiration to go to the university cannot find a place. What do we do about this? He said, we've got three options. One is we create universities. At that time, Vietnam was really poor, not like now. It's a middle-income country, okay, but it was really poor. We have no capacity to build new universities. We can send them overseas. We've got no money to provide scholarship. We can send them to distance education, as it was called then, online learning, basically. These students don't like online learning because they prefer to be in person, and have the social relationships that are associated with it. So if we don't do something about that, okay, we will have 16 students unemployed quite often in the streets creating trouble for the state. Okay, so we have to do something. So as a result, we have, as a government, decided we will let private players come in to establish campuses and establish various operations, largely as a way of making sure that at least some of the students will have the capacity to go to university locally without having to go overseas. Okay, can you see the argument? And this is, if you like, a consequence from his point of view of massification. If you're going to expect not 3% of the students going to university, but 30% of the university, and where is the space? Where are the teachers? Where are the possibilities? So that actually was the problem that they encountered. So what were the responses to this? Well, the responses were quite interesting. And there they borrowed most of these national systems borrowed very heavily from the literature that was coming out from World Bank, UNESCO to lesser extent, but to greater extent OECD. Okay, OECD was incredibly influential. So references to OECD and the World Bank were scattered throughout the paper. And not surprisingly, the prescriptions and the solutions to the problem were in classical image of neoliberal policy thinking. Okay, privatization, corporatization, vocationalization, audit culture, accountability, transparency, rethinking the curriculum, rethinking the pedagogy, making better use of technology, getting people familiar with the new conditions in which they'll have to work, enterprise, entrepreneurialism. You know the script, okay? The script is now very, very familiar. But all of these reports were more or less pointing to that, while at the same time highlighting the importance of preserving their local traditions and local values, okay? Without ever actually exploring how the two goals, preserving local values and local traditions, and privatization of the kind that was being promoted, may actually conflict with each other. Need not conflict with each other, but may. But that analytical issue was seldom examined. So basically, we read some of this literature. I read as many reports as I possibly can. And out of that, we said, we need to develop a course. There was no possibility of developing a course in on-campus mode because there were not enough students here, and we couldn't get enough students. We needed to get students who would not come to UI otherwise. So we basically decided that online was the only solution. And at that time, there had already been two relatively successful online programs that were going. One of them was called CETA. I don't know what CETA stands for, but Bill, as a historian, would know what CETA stands for. But Nick Bourboulis taught a course in that. Okay, and the other one was human resource development. That was another course there. And we talked to these people, the people who were teaching that course, and so saying, how do you do it? Can you train us? Can we sit in your classes? Can you show us? What are the issues? What are the things that we can overcome in all those? So we did a huge amount of work studying CETA and human resource development, and sort of saying, how can we build on the various? So basically, the way we decided was to make use of Moodle, which was already being used, and decided to have both synchronous and asynchronous. Okay, there's a whole range of work that you did in the synchronous mode and a whole range of work that you did in asynchronous mode. Okay, and together we developed our very loosely defined pedagogy, although the pedagogy was such that it constantly evolved as we figured out new things and new tools became available to us. Now then, question of, okay, how do we decide on which 6 courses and how do we do it? The way we decided is to say, what are the dimensions of global reports and the ideas that are absolutely essential for us to look at? And we came up with six major ideas. And these were policy, basically understanding the policy. And remember, we're in Department of Educational Policy Study, so we cannot not do policy, so we did policy. The other one was curriculum. The third one was governance. The fourth one was technology. The fifth one was work and HRD. And the sixth one was identity, culture, and difference. Okay, so those were the concepts that we decided needed to have courses. Okay, and then on top of that, we said we would have a mobility experience and study mobility. Okay, so 6. So we went around knocking at people's doors and saying, would you teach this course in this particular way of thinking about it? So I decided to teach the course on policy. Brenda Tefanenko taught the course of the first iteration with the curriculum, and she was not in educational policy studies. So there were a few problems about how do you distribute financial resources and manage and all those sort of things, as you might imagine. So there was a problem with Peter Kaczynski teaching a course on work and HRD, work and labor relations and global economy and HRD. So there were problems, but we overcame those. So Brenda Tevnenko was curriculum, Michael Peters was governance, okay, Nick Bourboulis was technology, pedagogy, and ethics, and we had Peter Kaczynski on work, labor relations, employment, and human resource development, and identity and culture. We approached Antonia Dada to teach, but she didn't have time or didn't want to or whatever. And I turned out teaching that particular course as well. So basically, we managed to get fairly significant heavy hitters to the extent that we could. And when Brenda Tevnenko could not do it any longer, we brought in Cameron McCarthy. So we had Cameron McCarthy, myself, Nick Bourboulis, Antonia Dada, Peter Kaczynski, and Michael Peters teaching this course. And they constituted the Global Studies program, faculty, if you like. Along with that, we managed to find something really, really interesting, is we decided that we can't simply have an online program. We had to have a PhD program. Not in ways all that different to the ways that Mary and Bill are doing it, that it is essential to have a PhD program that is doing the research and all those sort of things, and an online master's program that is largely teaching program. Okay, but they're also being encouraged to do some research, but they don't see themselves as following research career, whereas PhD students are. Okay, so that's the distinction that we do. So basically, what I managed to do, which would not be possible anymore, is persuaded the dean then, before Mary, Susan Fowler, and Richard Herman, who was the provost then, that some amount of money for this experiment should be set aside to pay for teaching assistants who can become the PhD students associated with these courses. So every course of 30 students had 2 teaching assistants, one looking after the technology matters and one looking after the content and communication matters. So as a result, courses were being taught by 3 people. And I saw this as a method of cross-subsidization. We were cross-subsidizing the income generated from master's program into the PhD program. Okay, and as a result, creating a community that was really quite important. So that's actually how we did it, and that was the structure. There was a fees charge, but then we did something else. When we had figured out this architecture of this course, we decided to try it out on teachers. So we organized a workshop with Champagne teachers, about 7 or 8, who came and sat with us for about 3 hours. And we went through the program and got huge amount of feedback. And as a result, fiddle around with whatever the program was. And then we took a large van and went to Chicago to do the same thing with Chicago teachers. Okay, so as a result, we had a pretty good understanding of what would be meaningful to students and what would not. Of course, there's never complete understanding, but sufficient understanding that was really quite useful to us in modifying and even having a look at references and sort of saying this will work, this one will work, and this one will work. It was great fun doing this exercise with teachers because all the TAs now appointed, about 10 of them, and the 6 or 7 teachers, we went out to dinner, we had lots of fun and all those sort of things. And as a result, out of this conviviality, which is an essential element of education as far as I'm concerned, out of this conviviality and hospitality emerged the course that we eventually taught. Okay, so that was basically the ways in which we did it. The courses ran really well. The response was absolutely incredible. Nicole will tell you that there were students who were doing all kinds of interesting stuff and reading very widely, suggesting references to us back, and engaging in discussions and conversation. What became clear to us is that there was desperate need at that time for such a course, okay? Because otherwise we would not have got them. We got students from around the world. There was a student from Saudi Arabia, full burqa and all those sort of things, but absolutely strident in her opinions. Always Sakina, her name was, you would remember Nicole, Sakina. She would, somebody would say something about Islam. Do you remember? This is post 9/11 about Islam. And she said, it's absolutely not true. Take it back, that kind of stuff. She was incredibly good. And I think Nicole is still in touch with her, and we're in touch with a lot of those students. There was another student who was a Hollywood actor, and came second, isn't that right? First in American Idol, he was one of our students, and he had done a master's degree in special education, and he'd just been appointed as a result of this celebrity status as a UNESCO ambassador. So he decided to take our course. Where he heard about it, I have absolutely no idea, because we did no advertising at all. It was all word of mouth, no advertising at all. And at that time, of course, the college was not known for its online programs in a way that it is now, So it really was quite interesting. And this student was a bit of a problem, because everybody would have known his name, because he was, I'm not allowed to say his name even now, he was so famous and so prominent. So we gave him a pseudonym. I think Nicole gave him a pseudonym, probably Michael Jones or something like that, something totally nondescript. And as a result, he was a very good student, and he participated every time until he got a major role in Broadway. In the theater, in a musical, and he had to leave the program halfway through. Anyway, those are the kind of things that happened as a result of the development. I've probably spent too much time talking about that, because I want to move on. Around 2007, 8, and 9, problems began to emerge, not only in relation to our understanding of the program, which was running very well, but in relation to the concepts that we were communicating, and the enthusiasm which we portrayed globalization as being something that was really a positive thing towards a cosmopolitan future. In other words, we recognized that we did not consider sufficiently the various critiques that were also available. There was no way that we could do that for two reasons in particular. One, GFC came along, and GFC really threw spanner in the book, in the narrative that we had developed, because we realized that the neoliberal globalization that we were not critiquing to the extent that it should have been, could not any longer be critiqued, could not be left untouched. That was one thing. The other thing that has happened that is these little things that we've got in all our hands. The little iPhones and iPads came along. That was in 2007. I think it was Tim Cook who went and sort of saying, this is an iPad, this can do these things. And all of a sudden, we had to figure out, what are its implications? What kind of data is going to be collected? What kind of issues might it raise? What kind of possibilities does it open up? And of course, in many ways, Bill and Mary's course is actually taking our suspicions to another huge level, But those were our concerns. Our concern, not only concerns, but also our imagination was running wild. We would get together and sort of saying, we've got this thing called iPad, we've got this thing called iPhone, each time we go there, we are recorded and all those sort of things. What kind of privacy issues is this raising? What kind of commerce is it going to? So all of those things that we talked about, the nature of economy, nature of work, nature of social relations, nature of state, all of those things were destabilized, okay, in 2008, 2009. And this actually created a huge problem for us. How do we teach the program, and whether the program needed huge range of modifications? Okay, not the structure that we had, but it needed to change quite substantially to take into account of those two things. But there were other things that were happening in the world that was also of concerns to us, including the emergence of the literature on decolonization. All of a sudden, phew, it was everywhere. And we had to actually deal with it in a way that even Cameron McCarthy, whose speciality it was to examine those issues, had not done. Okay. So as a result, all these new theoretical, practical, political, and policy issues are emerging. And we've got to rethink globalization. And we've got to think about a new idea of globalization, a new way of thinking about globalization. So I left before these questions got addressed or resolved in 2010, and basically have observed the program from a distance now. Okay, it's a very, very different program. But my own view is that some of the issues that are now emerging, okay, are absolutely crucial to understanding globalization. And as a result, in 2020 to 21, we produced this little book called Reimagining Globalization and oh, where is it? Oh, did I give it to somebody? No, it has disappeared. Sorry.
On the table there?
Oh, no, that's the, oh, yeah, under, sorry, beg your pardon. There it is.
Bravo.
Okay. So basically, it's called Reimagining Globalization. And basically, I will read the back cover. This book brings together leading scholars in global studies and education to reflect on how various developments of historic significance in recent years have unsettled the neoliberal imaginary of globalization. These developments include greater recognition of inequalities and the changing nature of work and communication, the emergence of new technologies of governance, datification, etc., AI, etc., a greater awareness of geopolitical shifts and tensions, the revival of nationalism, nationalism, populism, and anti-globalization sentiments, and the recognition of risks associated with pandemics and the climate change. Okay, in other words, conditions are changing. Okay, we've got to think and rethink globalization differently. And that's actually what the argument of this book is. I don't think it succeeds in presenting an alternative view of globalization. Nonetheless, it actually puts on table on the agenda some of these issues that have to be thought about. So just as in 2002, 2003, we developed a view of globalization that was consistent with the reports that then came out. Now we are living in a huge era of considerable social turbulence and much more rapid change than was the case even 20 years ago and even 10 years ago. So if we are going to take the notion of globalization seriously as a dynamic thing and not only something that is empirically out there, okay, then we've got problems, okay? We've got to teach very differently about globalization. We've got to teach it in a highly, highly dynamic manner, okay? Where we're taking people's ideas and people's experiences and incorporating them in our curriculum and in our pedagogy and in our evaluation. Because every aspect of education is potentially affected. Every aspect, pedagogy, evaluation, governance, policy, you name it, identity, culture, all of them are affected. Okay, so as a result, what we are now seeing is even stronger case for globalization to become integrated, but in ways that is radically different to the ways in which we did it in 2001 and 2010. Okay, so the question really is, how do you deal with the dynamics of globalization? How do you deal with the rapid changes? Of course, you might say, the best thing to do is to actually go inward, within ourselves, within our nations, and within our communities. Now, that's all very well at a rhetorical level. And you will see that throughout this year in the presidential elections this year. Okay, that particular sentiment is going to be presented over and over again. Why we are involved in Ukraine, why we are involved in Gaza, why we are involved around the world, and what has it got to do with us in simple ways? The problem, of course, is that many of these things are shaping our localities, are shaping our everyday life, and all those sort of things. So it's all very well to say that we can go inwards. The question is it possible to go inwards? Okay, and that makes it really, really very difficult for us to look at. To my mind, anti-globalization sentiments are easy to express, but much more difficult to establish and indeed to ignore. So globalization is there and probably going to accelerate in terms of the global networks that are going to emerge and global relations that are going to emerge and global forces that are going to become more and more intense. I mean, something like the technology that we have now become completely used to it, that's changing at a very, very rapid rate and changing in ways that is affecting every aspect of our lives. Okay, and if that is so, then we cannot actually honestly provide an education to students that are not unaware of these issues. They don't have to have mastery over it, but they have to actually understand the issues, and they have to actually sort of see. Luckily, quite often, as I was saying to Bill earlier on, that teachers, because they're engaging with the students on an everyday basis, okay, are much more aware of these changes that are taking place and how they're affecting the kids' lives than teacher educators are. Teacher educators are, in fact, a few steps behind. So exactly how teacher educators can catch up and develop courses in which these issues are not peripheral, okay, or for specialists, but are integrated into the structure of our teaching and learning. That is, to me, one of the really quite a fundamental issue. So the lesson that I can communicate to you now is that it was tough work for us to develop globalization and global studies course. And we did it with the help of a huge range of people, not only in education, but across the campus, including Ed and his Global Studies Center, and including Earl and other people. They were all contributing to us, okay? And as a result, we were open. We were open to the extent of saying, where can we get these ideas? What can we do to enrich our courses so the experience that we are providing and the questions and the issues that we are raising with the students are as contemporary as they possibly can be, okay, as profoundly meaningful as they possibly can. And I think that's the challenge. And of course, as changes take place at a much more rapid rate, it becomes a harder and harder task. So exactly how you deal with these issues is really something that to my mind is very important for us to consider. My own view is that there are two ways of thinking about it. One is to change and have some kind of commission every 3 to 5 years of a group of people who look at our global studies and education programs, so saying, what is still relevant? What needs to be transformed? What needs to be changed? That's one way of doing it. The other way of doing it is to say that we need to develop a mode of pedagogy, mode of teaching in which the whole thing is not driven by assumptions of stasis, but dynamism. Okay, with dynamism. Okay, that the world is dynamic and education must be too. Okay, and that is a tough challenge because we've been taught, as in more or less the banking way. We bank this, we bank this, we bank this. That metaphor doesn't make any sense any longer. Okay, because the change, what we are banking is no longer relevant as soon as it's banked. Okay, so those kind of questions become really quite urgent and quite important. So those are two approaches. Maybe we need to have approaches. But the other thing that I want to say in relation to global studies in education course, if I were doing it again, okay, what I would be doing is insisting that we do not go down the road of pick and choose, selectivity. Okay, the students can choose this. We provide them with a smorgasbord. Okay, in order to get grounded and serious understanding of these issues, we have to have coherent and sequentially designed curriculum, which is precisely what we teach in CNI. Okay, we have to practice what we preach. Okay, so in other words, core courses that actually provides the grounding against which selections can be made for electives. That's the way to go about it, rather than to do it and to assume that the entire course can be pick and choose. I think we do students disservice when we do that, and basically the randomized approach to doing a master's degree, I think is of course good for credentialism, but not very good for good education. Thank you very much.
Please direct your questions directly at Fred, you will presumably.
Of course, that's a general idea.
Please address your question directly to
On comments.
let's not be bashful, come on. Here, stay.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation, and apologies for getting here a little bit late because of back-to-back meetings. Thank you very much for all of the work that you do. I actually teach one of your chapters in my global studies course. So
Right, good.
I appreciate that, and so do my students. My question for you, and you may have addressed this earlier, I have a couple, but the first one is, how would you differentiate a global studies and education program from a comparative and international education program?
It's a very good question. The field of comparative in education, I'm just coming from CIES conference in Miami. Okay, so I know that association, and I think things have changed quite dramatically over the years. To my mind, the fundamental notion that differentiates those two traditions is focus on relationalities. Okay, focus on trying to understand what is the nature of the relationship between the work of international organization and the work of national governments. And then what is the nature of the relationship between national government and local schools? Okay, in other words, I absolutely want to focus on not attempting to understand a national system within its own terms. So as soon as I look at a policy from coming out of Canberra, which is the capital of Australia, okay, or of Washington, or of Singapore, the question I say, where has it come from? Okay, where the ideas have come from? Okay, in other words, we try to historicize and spatialize understanding of policies and practices immediately. You know, understand where it's come from, and both historically, what has it been built upon, and also how is it linked to what other countries are doing. So you can argue that policies in education are converging. I don't think that is right. Okay, I think they're converging to a certain extent, but in ways that are different. Okay, from each other. Okay, so the divergence and convergence is happening at the same time. Okay, and those kind of new questions that we need to look at as being the center of understanding the difference between comparative and international education and indeed global studies. I remain committed to the idea of global studies as opposed to international and comparative education. And I have tried within the society to make as much noise as I possibly can to get them to change their society's name. They're not going to do it, you know, because there's a long history and people are absolutely wedded to it. In any case, some of the people don't really buy some of my arguments, so that's understandable. Okay, But I do think that there is a strand of comparative and international education that is very mindful of the kind of questions that I find. I have lived in 4 different countries and probably have worked in 20 others. Okay. And as a result, I find it very difficult to look at a policy purely in terms of this country or Turkey or Lebanon. You know, I'm always asking questions. What is the colonial history? Okay, that has given rise to this policy. I'm working in Bhutan, and I'm constantly finding examples of how Bhutanese policies are affected by New Delhi, and how policies in New Delhi are affected by international organizations, including World Bank, and how it is affected by the history of colonialism. Those questions are much more important to me than the question of what is the structure of policy and what are the priorities. An intellectual exercise in this particular space really is about historicizing, looking at criticality, looking at relationality, doing self-reflexive work, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So try to understand policies not only in terms of the text, okay, but trying to understand the discourses and the institutions that contribute to it. Bob, sorry. Bob.
Thank you.
Stay,
Thank you.
Professor Stay.
Thank you. You've spent the hour worshiping adaptation, specification in circumstance, and looking at what is the world around us.
Mhm.
And then at the very end,
Mhm.
you make a pitch for
Mhm.
core studies.
Mhm.
Now, of course, there isn't something that is pure core studies or
Yeah.
pure adaptation.
Yeah.
But if you look at the history of education,
Mhm.
some of us
Mhm.
think we've made terrible mistakes by investing in
Cool.
core education, that the community, that the world stays the same.
Yeah.
Now, how can you make this pitch for
Yeah.
core studies
Yeah.
when you've just worshipped the idea of specification to circumstance?
By worshiping a different kind of core to the core that you're thinking of. Okay. My very good friend, Malcolm Skilbeck, who you probably know, actually, who died, unfortunately, just recently. Okay. He lived very close to where I lived, constantly talked about core. He was disillusioned with his own historical work on core. He was member of CDC, Curriculum Development Corporation in Australia. And then from there he went to Deakin University, and from there to OECD. And he was always, and he was a disillusioned core enthusiast. Okay, and I kept on saying that, Bob, the notion of core itself can be interpreted in a number of different ways. Okay, there is core, that is the universal essential core. Okay, and there's the core where you look at ideas, okay, with their changing meaning, needing to be investigated in order to do that, because otherwise you get randomness. So I'm actually fighting randomness, okay, which is, I'm afraid, quite ubiquitous in a market culture. Okay, I'll buy this, I'll buy this, I'll buy this. As a result, the students leave without a structured understanding of anything. Okay, so to me, I use the notion of core largely to refer to those concepts. So when we developed those 6 ideas, way back in 2003 and 4, okay, we didn't say what went into those courses in relation to technology, but we said, in order to understand the world as we experience it, we've got to actually have some understanding of each of those themes or components. So to me, it's the thematic core rather than content core. I don't know whether that helps or not, but I think you're absolutely right in pointing to the tension between those two. Mary.
Thank you. It's very interesting to hear that history.
Mhm.
But I think in the academy, generally, not just in ours, we have a new crisis.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what curriculum is information transmission
Yeah.
and some administration.
Mm.
The dynamic intellectual work that you talked about
Yeah.
in creating this product
Yeah.
or this experience
Mm.
and the resources it took, right? The money from your grant or the money from campus
Yeah.
or the interdisciplinary collaboration, the time to think.
Yeah.
Somehow that
Yeah.
is not facilitated
Mhm.
by who we are
Mhm.
and how work gets distributed within our own environment.
Sure.
I don't know whether it's just post-COVID,
Yeah.
you
No, no.
know, but the possibilities
Yeah.
for that communal, dynamic intellectual work
Yeah.
doesn't seem to be a priority in leadership. It doesn't seem to be a priority in resourcing.
Yeah.
Right? We just do information transmission, even when the world requires that we rethink almost everything that we have to do.
Yeah.
Right this moment, what generative AI has done,
Yeah.
what the crisis is around the world, almost every domain needs it. And
Yeah.
yet we have settled into this information
Yeah,
transmission and administrative
Yeah.
sharing of roles.
Yeah, sure.
How do we get out of that? Sorry, I
With,
don't
with,
want to be a
no, no,
pessimist.
with a great deal of difficulty. But I think that we can get out of it. Is something that we cannot give up on. Okay? No, but I tell you what, despondency has become a part and parcel of our engagement with the world. You know, it's interesting. You know, I personally think it's not COVID only. I think many of these things predated COVID. Okay, many of those problems predated COVID. Okay, and they came about as a result of massification, as a result of neoliberal governance, and as a result of the ways in which we have structured universities as entities, not for learning per se, but for some other purposes. Okay, so as a result, our very definition of university has shifted. Okay, so much so, and also, of course, what we've done with curriculum is we have got it into bite-sized pieces. Okay, and as a result, you know, certificate and sub-certificate and sub-certificate and sub-certificate have become really quite common. Okay, we have, if you like, been driven by credentialism in the ways in which those critics of credentialism in the 1960s and 70s didn't talk about. You know, this is a different kind of credentialism. And as a result, the students come with certain expectations, especially international students, okay? And as a result, they want to go through a particular set of experiences as predetermined, okay, through their imaginary of what the university is and what university should do, okay? And as a result, this is not only problem of resources. It's a problem of imagination. It's a problem of analysis. It's a problem of economics, you know. And so all of those problems are together, you know. So the challenges that we face in universities are product of all of these things working upon each other in a highly unhelpful ways. So despondency, yes. How do you get out of it? I personally think little experiments here and there. If we think that we can't move until the whole structure has been transformed, we are in hiding to nothing.
I agree with that.
Okay, or even smaller structures might change. So basically what we can do is sort of saying, I mean, there is no way that I would have been able to persuade the College of Education or even EPS, okay, that this course should go in the direction it did. There is no way, I know that. But we had decided we are happy enough to work with those 5 people. Okay, go on.
Yeah, the core, it seems to me the core is a function, at least in some major degree, as a function of the power and security preconditions of its definition in terms of its education. Specifically, your Vietnam experience.
Yeah.
Yes, we want the kids to be able to work in a market. Yes,
Yeah.
we want the kids to, in effect, be able to manage a unruly population.
Yeah.
And they have to have organizational skills for that.
Yeah.
China's a better case.
Yeah.
Globalization from the point of Xi Jinping is going to be radically different than what we find here in the gaggle of discussions here in the United States.
Yeah, yeah.
And so the question is, aren't there fundamental and boundaries that can't be vaulted unless you also face in the education of core studies,
Yeah,
the limits posed
Yeah.
essentially by power and security?
absolutely, absolutely. The ways in which the interior of the course, remember, I'm talking about thematic course, not what goes inside it, what gets discussed under the rubric of issues of identity and culture, let's say. You know, they have to have discussions of geopolitical tensions, the political rhetorics of various kinds, about security and otherwise, okay? Now, remember, when I was thinking about these issues about global studies, it was immediately after war. And I was doing it somebody who was potentially, my middle name is Abbas, okay? My middle name is Abbas, okay? This was a difficult time, okay, in relation to security. And my thinking was constantly steered towards questions of security and questions of safety and questions of geopolitical conditions and geopolitical tensions. Constantly, you know. So as a result, the examples that I was giving in my globalization and education policy course, you know, were derived out of my own sense of anxiety, okay, about living in the United States in 2002, 2003, 2004. Okay, so I think those details, but you know, as educators, we also have to have some view of the structure. Okay, some view of what is it that are the main coordinates within which we are talking about issues of power, issues of security, issues of geopolitical conditions, and et cetera, et cetera. You know, so basically the courses, the 6 courses that we developed, were really the coordinates which define the shape within which each of those people were trying to actually explore and were doing the teaching. I mean, I don't know what they were doing in their classrooms. I wasn't there. But I was personally, and Nicole would be in a better position to say that because she actually attended a number of people, a number of classes, okay, as to how they were dealing with this narrative that I presented to you. But that's the narrative that we developed, the 6 of us, okay? And we convinced our colleagues that but what they do and how they explore the issues still was entirely up to them. So, yeah.
So thanks for coming back and for your rich discussion and experience. We appreciate you
Thank you.
sharing all that with us. Good to know our investment paid off.
Oh, good.
I did a few years ago a phone survey of vice chancellors in Africa.
Yeah.
Sort of saying, what are your challenges and what are your of universities, vice chancellors of universities in Africa? The overwhelming challenges that they articulated was that they've got this huge 18-year-old cohort of people coming into the university. Africa's population growth 18 years ago was rather high, and that bulge is going through. Secondly, women are becoming much more possible for higher education because of different rules of marriage and employment and income. Then you've got all this distance education kind of possibilities. And all of that was, but the thing that they talked a lot about was they had a whole different structure from their governments than before. that they were getting a rather large portion of their higher education budget from Ministry of Education and other places.
Mhm.
Now that was dwindling significantly,
Mhm.
and they had to all of a sudden think of fundraising and foundations and all of this. So the whole world was changing under their feet.
Mhm.
And they said, we don't know what to do, frankly.
Mhm.
And so this notion of leadership development, I think one of the keys to changing things is
Mhm.
trying to help leaders
Yeah.
understand and become more creative, et cetera. And I'm not talking about just leaders of universities, but I'm talking about leaders of ministries of education and so forth. You go from there to Korea and Japan and you do a phone survey of the leaders of higher education institutions, you get a different picture.
Sure.
I'm sure they're looking for students, then their population, we have 22 countries in the world are having.
Dwindling population, yeah.
Right. So this incredibly diverse
Mhm.
higher education picture emerges. It's always been diverse, but it seems to me it's getting even more critical and we need much more creative kind of solutions. Is there a way in which we ought to be thinking of how to help develop leadership in ministries and higher education institutions for this new phenomena and these global challenges that we all face, quite different depending on the location you're at?
Sure, sure.
How
of
would you
course.
go about thinking about that?
That's a $1 million question, not even $65,000, $64,000 question. There's a wonderful book that I'm not sure whether you looked at by a Columbia professor of African background, of Ugandan background, of Indian Ugandan background, I might say, called Mahmood Mamdani. Okay, he wrote a very interesting book on his experiences as the Dean of Humanities at Makerere, okay, in Kampala. Okay, really, really, really very interesting book, well worth reading. Okay, and he basically described some of his challenges, and I've got to tell you, the self-reflexivity and criticality that's evident in this book is truly inspiring. Okay, to me anyway, because he's sort of saying, here are the pressures, not only of the new world, but of the old world, the colonialism. Okay. And you're kind of crunched as a meat in the sandwich, okay? And at the institutional level, there are pro-vice chancellors and there are vice chancellors, and then there are lecturers and faculty, and dean is caught right in the middle of it, crunched again. So he basically describes a story of multiple crunches, multiple meats in sandwiches, okay? And his idea is that of course these problems are emerging of massification of universities being directed by their ministry to perform in a certain way, and if they have a loan from World Bank, then its requirements. I mean, structural adjustment is gone, but it's still there. We know that, and Washington Consensus is not quite dead, etc., etc. Okay, and so you're working in this very, very complicated space in Africa. I work at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. Of course, South Africa is distinctive compared to other parts of South. And I talk to the Pro-Vice Chancellor, teaching and learning there every so often, just a cup of coffee and things like that. And the pressures he feels are absolutely incredible.
Yeah.
And one of the pressures he's feeling is that we have given students a voice that they didn't have before, and they're exercising it.
And given them,
We have given students a voice that they didn't have
Yeah.
before, okay? And they're exercising it. It is actually becoming quite significantly worrying for him. So the roads must fall, and decolonization movement is not driven by theorists, it's driven by students, okay? So he says, we are just seeing the consequences of where we have found ourselves through some of our own decisions, which were perfectly justifiable, but they have had their consequence. They're now apparent. So as a result, and just about everything that you said needs to be understood in terms of its antecedent and its other conditions. So for example, why do ministers have certain expectations? because of some reasons. We need to understand those reasons, both historically as well as in the contemporary politics. Okay, so I think that's the problem. I've just come back from Japan 3 months ago, and I went to a number of universities, and I hear them describe some of the same problems, despite the dwindling population. You know, so the similarities are there too across systems which are very, very different. I mean, in Korea, apparently gross enrollment rate is now 103%. There are more students who are studying universities. That's because there are, people who are doing 2 or 3 degrees simultaneously. Okay, so as a result, more than 100% of the population is doing, or the cohort is doing higher education. What's going to happen to these people? We have pushed access and equity and all those agenda very hard. But we haven't thought through as to what's going to happen to these people once they graduate and once they have certain expectations.
I hope all of you can now join me in thanking Professor. Very good.
Thank you.
And there is a reception on the other side of this room, so you can also enjoy each other's company.
Good to see you. Great to see you, actually. I hope I didn't